to exercise that voice. It just seems like both parties are banking on the electorate getting smaller and smaller when you look at who they are choosing to ignore year after year.
Well, in the case of the Democrats, I think your assessment is correct. But what your assessment is leading to is the objective reality of how a party completely ignores its most important base. They're basically working class people, white people. They take that base for granted because they believe that they have no place else to go. So until there's real political accountability and political consequences for not adhering to the demands coming from your base, then that kind of taking for granted will continue. I mean, when Biden signals that they're going to reach across the aisle, and it maybe even includes some Republicans in the cabinet, while at the same time almost making it impossible for representatives of their liberal, what are they saying? They're thumbing their nose up at their base, and they will do that as long as the base dutifully falls into line every 2 or 4 years in opposition to some kind of existential threat coming from the Republicans. It's a game.
Yeah, it's pretty funny, too, here, just looking at some of the Senate races, just how ironic or just fitting it was that a bunch of these Democratic senator nominees were former military people. I mean, and it was like, wait a second, you're supposed to be kind of the party of freedom or racial justice or economic justice, or a softer stick, more of the carrot than the stick. And you got MJ Hager there in Texas. You have
Amy McGrath,
pilot there. Even the Tennessee person they ran there, James Mackler, former Army helicopter pilot. So, John, I thought it was pretty funny. Mark Kelly there in Arizona, an astronaut, the Space Force now, obviously the military and space. But I thought that, John, everybody wants to try to pretend that the Democratic Party is this one thing, but they don't even put on a face to try to hide what they're doing and who they are.
They really don't. They really don't. I mean, the late Bruce Dixon from Black Agenda Report was one of the first ones to bring attention to the fact that there was a conscious strategy on the part of the Democratic Party to bring in these kinds of military oriented elements as candidates. It's part of the party with its continued march to the right, in the belief that this is where the U.S. electorate is, and it really isn't. It's we look at, and that's one reason why they are struggling today or this evening in Florida, because the turnout among African Americans, even among non-Cuban Latinos, appears to have been very weak. So there's a whole different mood in the country right now that these folks are missing, and it doesn't bode well for the party, and it really doesn't bode well for U.S. politics, because I'm concerned about fascism, but not the fascism from the sort of cartoonish images evoked with the focus on Donald Trump and those elements that even Steve Bannon called clowns. I'm concerned about the neo-fascism emerging from the neoliberal right that's really empowered, that really controls the state, that really is the hegemonic force in this country, and the way they're moving to constrain political discourse, to impose a very narrow range of acceptable politics. That is where the totalitarian threat is coming from.
Shane Stranahan, I hear you had a follow-up question here for Ajama. Go for it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. Ajama, thank you for being with us. I'm curious, looking forward to 2024, 2028. Obviously, it's too late for this one now, but if you were to try to reform the DNC, or if you were to try to put forward a viable alternative that could steal its thunder, so to speak, that could replace it in a long-lasting way, what would that look like? Where do you think that would go?
Well, I think we saw within the Democratic Party, I think we saw the potential of a real insurgency galvanized around the Bernie Sanders campaign. Unfortunately, Bernie Sanders was a flawed candidate in the sense that he was not prepared to take it all the way. He really believed that this BS about Donald Trump being this existential threat, and therefore he would allow the party to steal the nomination from him and to demoralize his supporters. But the kind of movement that they were organizing really demonstrated the potential. They built internal structures. They had independent fundraising apparatus. They had some clear politics, even though they weren't as radical as some of us would hope. But they dealt with some of the very important issues that were on the minds of the public. Issues like Medicare for all. So that potential is there. I'm not one of the ones that say that you cannot, in fact, organize an internal insurgency in the party and be successful within the Democratic Party. I believe that can happen. It hasn't really happened before, except for this year. So I think we saw in that insurgency the contours of a social democratic alternative, if you will, that will probably gain some steam in the next few years, because neoliberalism cannot address the objective contradictions of this current moment. And so politics in the U.S. have two ways to go, toward a more blatant neo-fascist kind of capitalist reform, or toward a more radical socialistic orientation in this country.
I agree with you that neoliberalism can't necessarily deal with the problems or contradictions of the problems themselves. However, there is fear. And right now, the argument of you have nowhere else to go, or Donald Trump, like you say, is a unique existential threat. And that's just it. It's every 4 years, there's another existential threat that goes on and goes on. And for the most part, people accept the argument. I mean, lefties accept the argument to the tune of like 70%. So do blacks accept the argument to the tune of like 70%. Is it that basically, it's not that the Democratic Party believes that the electorate is there. They just don't care. And they recognize that the large segment of the electorate is going to vote for them regardless of what they do. It's like a warm body keeps the night at bay type stuff.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's what I alluded to earlier, that basically until there's a sufficient political consequence for taking the electorate for granted, then they will continue to, in fact, do that. But I think that there's been a shift. I think as a consequence of the Sanders campaign internally in the Democratic Party, and the fact that there are more progressives in that party, and that they have been able to experience what it means to be able to be assertive, they're not going to be as controllable as they were just 2 years ago. So there will be more pushback from their left pole. But, it really remains to be seen how far that's going to go. But again, that's the only direction that it can go. It's clear that people are not prepared to support a third-party challenge. The legal apparatus that makes it difficult to participate for a third party is very difficult to overcome. But it's quite clear that not only within the Democratic Party, we have to have a new movement for democracy here in this country in order to open up the system and to push back against those forces that are attempting to try to impose a very narrow range of acceptable power. And again, that push is coming from
Ajama Baraka, national organizer for Black Alliance for Peace and Green Party vice presidential candidate in 2016. Thanks so much. I'm Michelle Witte here in D.C. with Bob Schlehuber and Jamarl Thomas, Lee Stranahan, and Shane Stranahan remotely. We're going to take a quick break before we return for more of our live coverage of the wild 2020 presidential contest.
listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
You're listening to special coverage on Radio Sputnik.
Oh, yes. Our coverage continues here on Radio Sputnik live on election 2020. I am Sean Blackman, the co-host of By Any Means Necessary here on Radio Sputnik, here with my intrepid, incredible co-host, Jackie Lukman, also continuing to be joined by Shane Stranahan and Jamarl Thomas of Fault Lines, also of Radio Sputnik. And we're going to kick off the hour right now with a piece on mail-in ballots, and we'll be right back.
Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the issue of mail-in voting has taken center stage in the 2020 election. Even before Election Day, a record number of mail-in ballots had been cast. And as you might expect, the issue has become not just highly politicized, but pretty heated.
All right.
Excuse me, when you have 80 million ballots,
I have a final
Senate
question.
is swamping the system. You know it can't be done. You know it can't. And already there's been fraud.
Mail service delivers 185 million people in 8 states.
But if you go beyond the campaign bickering, the massive number of mail-in ballots cast this year has created some real challenges for election officials. Some of those challenges are created by the different rules that states use about when to start counting those ballots. For example, 3 of the key battleground states in 2020, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, have rules that don't allow officials to even start counting the ballots until Election Day or just beforehand. That's already led to multiple Supreme Court decisions about when those votes can be counted in just the past few weeks.
The Supreme Court is proving to be a key piece of the 2020 election in these final days. The Supreme Court's conservative majority is refusing to extend Wisconsin's deadline to receive mail-in
And then in that
ballots.
Pennsylvania case, a lower court ruling that says the state must count ballots arriving 3 days after Election Day. That will stay in place.
All of this has created a very confusing situation for voters, many of whom are distrustful of the system after hearing about allegations of election meddling for the past 4 years that didn't pan out. Add to that big tech companies like Twitter and Facebook, and what they say is an attempt to clarify the situation and keep voters from disinformation, have taken the unusual step of labeling tweets and other messages, some of them by President Trump himself, saying that they were spreading misinformation about mail-in voting. And just to add to that confusion, some of the claims made by President Trump have actually been borne out by local news reporting.
They have mailmen with lots of it. Did you see what's going on? Take a look at West Virginia, mailmen selling the ballots. They're being sold. They're being dumped in rivers. This is a horrible thing for our country. This is not going to end well.
A mail carrier in West Virginia has admitted to charges that he manipulated absentee voter requests. Dry Fork resident Thomas Cooper pleaded guilty to single counts of injury.
Then there's the issue of the post office. The arguments between Democrats and Republicans over the Postal Service came with criticism of Donald Trump for appointing a new Postmaster General who came from private industry and was focused on efficiency.
He's doing, I can only tell you, he's a very smart man. He'll be a great Postmaster General. And he needs, obviously, if you're going to do these millions of ballots out of nowhere, he's going to obviously need funding.
I don't think members on either side of the aisle or either side of the Capitol can tell you that they've ever had such an immediate reaction to a change in how an agency affects their lives. This is not a business. They keep saying, well, it loses money. It's a service.
Whatever the result of today's elections, and whenever we find out those results, one thing is sure. As long as the COVID-19 pandemic persists, the idea of mail-in voting will continue to be a contentious one.
Yeah, and you know, Jackie, I think it's absolutely true that the issue of mail-in voting has been and will continue to be a contentious issue, because when it was first raised, it was sort of posed as, you know, right-wingers are attacking the mail-in ballot piece, and therefore, you know, supporting mail-in voting was a good thing. And I mean, personally, I do believe mail-in voting something that should be accessible and expanded. I did it myself because that was pretty easily available here in Washington, D.C. I think we were different and actually kind of lucky in that sense. But, and also of course, it's a fact that Donald Trump and his administration and the Republicans have tried voter suppression in a number of ways. But it is also true that the United States just isn't equipped from an infrastructure standpoint to handle the deluge of mail-in ballots that will be coming in during this election. So to me, it's a serious question about in this country, and this is a contradiction you raise a lot, I think, on by any means necessary. In a country that upholds the vote above all else, it seems to refuse to make the vote not only as accessible as possible, but to make the actual count of the votes sort of, as accurate as it can be, and in my opinion, sort of putting an obstacle to that kind of democracy itself.
Exactly, which always brings the issue up that I think is a very valid issue about whether we actually have a democracy or not. When we're talking about other countries in the developed world that don't have this thing called voter registration, where you have to opt in to vote. Like as soon as you turn 18, you are eligible to vote, or whatever the legal voting age is in a lot of countries. It's not something that citizens have to proactively do. It's just a right that you're signed up for as a citizen. And with the advancement and the development of this country, the amount of money that this government allocates just to the Department of Defense every single year, it makes absolutely no sense that there was a fight over funding the post office, which at first didn't make a whole lot of sense. But when you started to look at the way absentee ballots were going to factor into the election, then into this election, then you understood why they were under attack the way they have been, because nobody wanted to do anything to the post office that much before now. And just the amount of money that this government gives to the Department of Defense every year makes no logical sense in the inability that this country has to do something as simple as count mail-in ballots. It's not a complicated enterprise. It's not putting somebody on the moon, which I understand we're about to do again. There's going to be another manned moon exploration. But we can't count absentee ballots? For real, though? That makes no sense to me.
Yeah, Shane Stranahan of Fault Lines, I'm curious your thoughts about this. I mean, what are you sort of thinking and feeling about how the mail-in vote issue has sort of been playing out in what it seemed to be would be a country that would be more than well prepared, but seems to, not be up to snuff, even with all of its, pronouncements towards sort of being the paragon of democracy and electoral processes?
Well, apparently in nearly 250 years, we have not figured out how to deliver mail properly. That is one of the takeaways from this. I mean, another side of this is one face of a sort of America's stagnant political system. Problems with our government run deep, and politics, as we're seeing tonight, isn't necessarily going to be the immediate solution to those problems. It's not going to solve everything right now, depending on who we voted. I just wanted to throw this in there. Since the start of the hour in the last 10 minutes, AP News has announced a bunch of big wins. So Donald Trump has won, according to AP Press, Louisiana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Nebraska. Biden, meanwhile, has picked up New York and New Mexico. Ben Sasse won a re-election to the U.S. Senate in Nebraska. Mike Rounds in South Dakota won re-election to the Senate there. In North Dakota, Governor Doug Burgum won his seat. And in Wyoming, Cynthia Lummis, a Republican, won her seat back. So just giving a quick update there.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shane. I do appreciate that. And, Jamarl, Shane makes an important point, I think, because, he was jokingly saying, 250 years, we haven't figured out how to deliver the mail. But what that points to me is that, from the very foundation of this country and the very sort of origins, if you will, of the vote and how it's carried through and who the very process was designed for, I think has indelibly colored the way we're seeing these processes play out today. I mean, if we look at institutions like the Electoral College, which is a relic of slavery itself and sort of our continuing reliance on the Supreme Court, a fundamentally undemocratic institution itself, I mean, it seems as though a lot of the difficulties that we've seen flow from this election, at least to me, seem like a commentary, perhaps even indictment on the way a lot of these things are sort of set up here in the United States.
Yeah, and indictment is an understatement, and it's not an issue of the male. I mean, it's an issue of people being in power or in positions of power that are predatory, and they think to themselves, "Hey, if the post office wasn't there, I can make God's tons of cash," despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of the public is for it. So then you have these attacks on the postal office in order to undermine it, to cut the budget, to make them suffer in regards to their difficulty and make them hurt for cash. And then it's like, oh, look at the post office. Yeah, it's a service. You pay for services. It's just kind of is what it is. So it's not an issue that the post office can't do their job or can't get the mail to the people. Post office has done their job magnificently. The issue is that somebody was trying to cripple it, overtly so. And not just cripple it, even, was even making a piece of change on the side when you find out that his company, he was basically using the investments of his company was competing against the postal service. But if you want to say that that's an indictment in regards to kind of the logic of things, that there is not a higher idea or higher ideology, that it boils down to the lowest common denominator of how do I win, and do I win at any cost? You know what I mean? Like, you can get into that point, and I think that's a fair point to make. Meaning, it's one thing to have an idea of America that goes beyond this notion of just I need to win. Meaning, right. The notion of America going to the idea of America itself. This idea that people vote and the people come in, whoever wins and everything else, and the people are making a choice. But that's not what we do. For us, it's you got to win, period. Doesn't matter what the public wants. And if the public doesn't want you, then that's an unfortunate, hurdle that you just have to get over. It's astonishing. But I think that's the way we do our politics here. And so if you're talking about an indictment in that sense, definitely. I agree.
Yeah, and I think Jamarl may be correct there, Jackie. And, I'm always, frankly, a lot of times I have to laugh, like at a lot of these sort of narratives that we hear so often when it comes to voting, within the context of Jamarl's comments there, and, about how it's always, this is the most important election, and this is what your ancestors died for, and all those sorts of things. But it always seems to be devoid of this very historical context that we're talking about right now. You know what I mean? And it's almost like it assumes that all of these processes and institutions basically are working either for the good or at least neutral. And if we just act a certain way, we'll work towards our benefit. You know what I mean? And so for me, it just sort of shows the deep sort of structural maneuvering, if you will, that sort of makes these things function the way that they do, and why there is a duopoly here in the United States in the first place, with two parties made up of the ruling class that have, built a fortress around, the vice grip that they have on politics here in the United States. I mean, and as such, if what we're talking about is what our ancestors fought for, what they fought against was, systemic oppression, white supremacy, right, and all those sorts of things. So if what we're saying we want to do is, make our ancestors proud, then it seems we have to, get at the root of these things. And if we're going to cast a ballot, cool. But if our activity is sort of, relegated to just that every 2 or 4 years, then personally, I just kind of feel like we've really missed something.
Yeah, we definitely missed the entire foundation of, the rot underneath the duopoly. I mean, because people focus so much on the two-party system, but they really don't focus on what the system was built on. And that was, honestly, the enfranchisement of white landowning slaveholders who wanted to keep power, to keep people who were not like them from voting. And every group of people that has been able to attain the right to the voting franchise had to do it with a struggle. And a lot of times a physical struggle. And people in this country have this weird notion that just because laws passed, everybody just followed the law when the laws were passed. When we look at our history of our ancestors in this part of the struggle for liberation, the right to vote, we see that was not at all the case. Yeah, it was illegal to keep Black men after the Civil War ended from voting because they were given voting rights. And what did a lot of white people who didn't like that do? They killed people. They literally killed people, even though the law told them that it was legal to allow Black men to vote. So, I mean, the idea that we've got a bunch of politicians today who are hypocritical in deed, when you've got people like Trump and practically everybody in the GOP who votes by absentee ballot because they don't work in the state that they represent. They live here, they work here, but their residence is in the state they represent. So most of them vote by absentee ballot. And they have made this big deal in this particular election about how awful mail-in ballots are. That's just the modern reflection of the corruption and the rot and the hypocrisy that was really built into this system. And if we do not deal with the fact that this system was built on that kind of hypocrisy, every 4 years, Sean, you're right, we're going to keep having another conversation about this other thing that really is not allowing real change as people continue to buy into which of these two parties should I vote for to save me from the other one.
Yeah, and Shane Stranahan, I feel like what we're discussing here and so many of the contradictions with voting and how it plays out here in the United States, I feel like it's sort of a part and parcel of why the U.S. is in a real political crisis here at this moment, at least in my humble opinion it is. And I think that some of the results of that have been manifested in the demonstrations that we've been seeing in the streets for months now. And just this past weekend, I had a journalist from Greece ask me, whether I thought, the people who were demonstrating would, go to vote and would they vote for Biden. I said, well, some of them may vote. I don't doubt that. But I think the part of the issue is that folks in the street feel like, voting, whether you do it or not, can never be the sort of, key to a liberation or the key to systemic change or to any of these sorts of things, because the bankruptcy of the political mainstream has made itself so apparent. And we're down to our last couple of minutes here before we move to a break here, Shane, but just wondering how you sort of see, the protests kind of factoring in, or perhaps maybe a consequence of some of these contradictions.
Well, they're real political engagement. I mean, voting at the end of the day, you're going into a booth, a polling place, you're putting a pencil on paper, and that if that's the extent of your engagement in a democracy, then you don't have a democracy. You have a sort of vaguely participatory oligarchy, and that is what we're living in. So when you look at the protests, that is one form of political engagement. But something I really want to see, this is maybe a bit of a tangent, but institution building, and this happens pretty much always on the local level. Building up local communities, local networks of self-sufficiency, building in your sort of grassroots grid. And if you do that, in the long run, if you're increasing your local power, then you have at least a foothold to stand on in a contest on a federal level. I mean, we're talking about the federal government tonight, obviously talking about states and how those are going to play out in terms of senators and representatives getting elected, but everybody's eyes on the presidency. That's one part of it. But if you lose that like bedrock 1 minute stone foundation of democratic participation, then in a real sense, you have lost your democracy.
Definitely. And with that, we're going to move to a quick break here on Radio Sputnik. Please join us when we return for more of our election night coverage 2020.
This is Radio Sputnik.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
You're listening to special coverage on Radio Sputnik.
Oh, yes, we have returned Radio Sputnik Election 2020 night coverage. I am here, Sean Blackman, host of By Any Means Necessary, with my co-host, Jackie Lukman. Continue to be joined by Shane Stranahan and Jamarl Thomas of Fault Lines Radio. Also here, of course, on Radio Sputnik. And we are now happy to be joined by Max Blumenthal, editor of The Gray Zone and author of the recent book, The Management of Savagery. Max, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Sean.
Absolutely. And, you know, Max, one of tonight's top stories, I mean, right now in my home state of Florida, with 93% of the vote tally, Donald Trump definitely seems to be ahead here. It looks like he's perhaps down by less than 10 points in Miami-Dade County, where Hillary Clinton won by nearly 20 points in 2016. That county alone seems to be a big part of why Biden is currently losing Florida. So, Max, I'm wondering if you could sort of tell us where this pro-Trump trend in Florida is coming from. How does it intersect with the U.S. government's actions in Latin America? And what are the ramifications, in your opinion, for the next 4 years and beyond?
Well, I see a lot of people saying that Florida is the silver lining on climate change and rising sea levels. But I think we just have to look at the actual demographic reality of the situation and how Trump has outperformed himself in 2016 in Miami-Dade County, which is a traditional Democratic stronghold. We just published an article that I think helps explain Trump's victory, a very striking victory considering that polls were showing Biden winning by a significant margin. And it explains it through the prism of the Latin American diaspora, the growing diaspora in and around Miami-Dade, Broward County, and Palm Beach. This is where the two campaigns have invested the bulk of their energy and where Trump has a significant advantage. We know, and this article, by the way, is written by a student at Florida International University, Sebastian Lamaglio, who grew up in that environment, who is completely immersed in the world of the Latin American right and understands how extreme the media that has been pipelined straight into the veins of that population is, how it's drawn from Breitbart, from Fox News, from all the far-right sites, and complemented it with its own historical anti-communist hysteria to paint Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as communists. And I think that is a characterization that everyone in your studio would just laugh at, the idea that Biden is a communist. But it's widely believed there. And it's believed not only by the traditional Cuban-American bloc that has comprised a stronghold sort of constituency for the Republican Party, but by new constituencies, specifically the Venezuelan diaspora, which has supported Juan Guaido and which the Republican Party has invested heavily, and the Colombian diaspora. In fact, over the past year or two, the right-wing government of Ivan Duque and his mentor, Alvaro Uribe, have sent officials into Miami media to campaign for Donald Trump, interfering in the U.S. election, as have Juan Guaido's officials. His former chief of staff, Roberto Marrero, spoke at the last-minute Trump rally 2 days ago. And so by bringing these new right-wing constituencies in, who have been supported and cultivated by the U.S. in their countries and have left due to the instability that they themselves have caused, the Republicans are seeking to turn Florida into a solid red state. And I think that strategy has been ratified tonight. And that has implications for U.S. policy in Latin America if Donald Trump wins. If Donald Trump wins, then they're going to do more blockades, more extreme sanctions, more coups to satisfy this radical constituency that delivered them a key swing state.
But, Max, I get what you're saying about, more blockades and more sanctions and such from a Trump administration. But wouldn't the same things come from a Biden administration? I mean, I don't see Biden's foreign policy toward any of the countries that the diaspora that exists in Miami or in any other region in Florida, from Cuba, from Venezuela, from Colombia. I don't see the democratic foreign policy toward those countries changing from the very antagonistic and oppressive imperialistic footing that it's on right now. Wouldn't those policies be pretty much the same if Biden wins the presidency?
I think the broader outlines of the U.S. strategy we're in relationship with Latin America will be the same. Biden is taking credit for Plan Colombia, which helped sort of exterminate the FARC and militarize Colombia. He's also taken credit, justifiably so, for the so-called Alliance for Prosperity, which has helped put into power and support the right-wing governments of the Northern Triangle in Central America, which are sort of seen as a key U.S. bloc for implementing neoliberal policies. But at the same time, we've seen Biden officials comment in the New York Times that they're going to drop the kind of gunboat diplomacy and the Monroeism of the Trump administration to Latin America and revert to the Obama strategy of what they would call anti-corruption efforts, which in fact were lawfare, where the Department of Justice would meddle in the political systems of countries like Brazil, and they, successfully drummed out left-wing leaders like Dilma Rousseff, then helped initiate the Lava Jato car wash investigation that saw Lula da Silva go to jail and paved the way for Bolsonaro. Now Bolsonaro is the president of the most powerful country in South America, and a country that has been used by the Trump administration to help implement this policy of regime change towards Venezuela. The problem there is if Biden wins, Bolsonaro has completely cast his lot with Donald Trump. He has openly identified with Trump. His son is part of Steve Bannon's international right-wing organization, and that's going to cause some friction. The Biden administration may choose to support another leader who is not as far right. For example, the governor of the Sao Paulo region, who is sort of center-right, or someone like Sergio Moro, the justice minister, who the CIA seems to like. So I think, the broader outlines are the same, but the policies may actually differ in tone and sophistication.
Yeah, Shane Stranahan, Jamarl Thomas, I don't know if you all wanted to get in there.
Yeah, I was going to jump in. Max, welcome to the show, man. We really do appreciate you coming on tonight for the election night coverage.
Yeah. Thanks for being a beacon of sanity out there.
Well, I followed. Well, it's the same to you. I mean, I followed your coverage on this stuff. You seem to be, you put it in perspective, or you put it in context in a way that people can understand and digest it. If Trump does look like he's going to pull out Florida for today, even though he may lose some of the other states in this case. What do you think people in Florida was voting on that the other states weren't? Meaning, like, if Florida ends up being an outlier, why is Florida an outlier? Is it just the Hispanic community in Florida? I mean, is there something else going on in Florida?
Well, I don't know if it's going to be an outlier, but, Florida also has, the panhandle. I mean, Sean knows this as well as anyone. He knows the geography. The panhandle is what they call the Redneck Riviera.
Yep.
And like the de facto capital of that part is Pensacola. And, that area is Trump country. That area actually came in late after Miami-Dade. Biden also, the Democrats, I overstated the advantage of the Republicans for Latinos in Florida, who are different than the Latinos in Texas, who are of Mexican descent, who tend to despise Donald Trump, will vote for Democrats in around at 70% rates. But even among the Venezuelan diaspora and the Colombian diaspora, there are also like 100,000 Bolivians in Florida. TPS, temporary protective status, is an important ace card that the Democrats have up their sleeve. And even as Biden invested $42 million in Texas, including lots of Spanish language media, he didn't play that ace card very hard. I think the overall messaging of the Biden campaign has been, we don't care about Bernie's constituency, and Latinos writ large were very pro-Bernie because of his economic policies, but also because Obama and Biden were the deporters in chief, and Biden campaigned. He has run a very center-right campaign. He has catered specifically to suburban white women in almost every aspect, and stepped on Bernie's constituency, which includes Latinos. So I think that hurt him in Florida, but surprisingly, Biden's doing pretty well in Texas, and I think that's just because of the general trajectory of Texas demographically, just the changing nature of the state. It is now a purple state, and we'll see how it shakes out. If Trump loses Texas, I think it's pretty much all over for him.
I can't help but think you're right. Thank you so much for joining us, Max. This is Shane here. Texas, 43% of the precincts right now reporting in, and Biden actually has a half a point lead. So it's 49.6 to 49.1 in Texas. In Florida, a very, very different scenario playing out. 93% of precincts reporting with Trump 51.3, Biden 47.8. I'm actually going to reference to the New York Times has this needle thing that it's using to look at precinct shifts and demographic shifts. We were talking earlier about the shift in the Cuban vote, also the Colombian expat vote. Cubans are the biggest outlier in terms of looking at the difference between 2016 and 2020. In 2016, 55% of the Cuban neighborhoods, majority Cuban neighborhoods, went for Democrats. Now it's 59% for Republicans. So it's like a 14% swing. That is the largest swing demographically. That's followed by, in second place, the second largest swing since 2016 is in the Hispanic neighborhoods. 61% Democrats now become 51% Republicans. So a strong majority lead for Democrats in the last election, now switched to a sort of very, very small majority lead for Republicans. That's startling. I'm actually going to turn completely, though. I just wanted to sort of give a little capstone to that conversation we're having there. I'm curious, Max, where do you think this is going to, whether Biden wins or Trump wins, where do you think this is going to leave Julian Assange in either one of those cases? Max, what's your take?
Well, we just saw the redacted portions of the Mueller report today reveal that Mueller was prevented from prosecuting Julian Assange and WikiLeaks over supposed Russian collusion because, in his words, the facts were not there. He was obstructed by the facts. That definitely helps Julian Assange's case in it from an objective standpoint. It's a very good reason why Robert Mueller declined to interview Julian Assange, because he may have gathered some countervailing facts that would have shattered the entire premise of the investigation. But that doesn't mean that Donald Trump being reelected will bode well for Julian Assange. And I could see a Biden administration just kind of kicking the can down the road, just avoiding any coherent effort to extradite Assange to avoid whatever political consequence that could have in a Northern Virginia district court right in the White House's backyard. And beyond that, I can't see any positive scenario for freeing Julian Assange under the leadership of either of these figures. It's also clear to me that if Trump wins, Mike Pompeo will still be in the administration. And this is the figure who took it as his personal initiative as CIA director to destroy WikiLeaks. In his first speech as CIA director in April 2017, Mike Pompeo laid out the campaign of black operations against WikiLeaks. So this is something he wants to take credit for, and I expect Mike Pompeo to be a Republican candidate for president in 2024. Finally, Biden has commented on Julian Assange. He referred to him as a digital terrorist. So not many good options here.
Yeah, to be sure. Go ahead, Jamal.
Oh, no, I was just going to say the Mike Pompeo thing. I keep telling people, your time is not going to stop. Like this notion, of you have nowhere else to go and everything else. There's always going to be another boogeyman, a Ted Cruz, a Tom Cotton, or a Mike Pompeo waiting in the wings.
Exactly.
Lefties have to come up with this understanding of, are they going to stand and make a demand in regards to what they want and pull their country back? Like, Trump supporters always talk about taking their country back. What they really need to talk about has to do with the number of people who are voting against the other person. Like, we're out of aspirational politics where we're voting for somebody because we all, despite the fact all of these things are falling apart. All of these things are falling apart. And we're voting for people to get somebody out of office, not because, for somebody to fix it. It's utterly appalling. Like, it's disturbing from the standpoint of a level of politics. Max, I'm curious from your standpoint, and when you're looking at other countries, especially when you're looking at South American countries, let's say Venezuela, for example, is there opposition in Venezuela that goes beyond just this kind of puppet, ridiculousness of Juan Guaido against Maduro? Like, what is the political scene like in somewhere like Venezuela? Can you explain, give us the mechanics?
Well, I mean, if you read U.S. media, you'd think that the opposition in Venezuela is the entire country of oppressed people who just want democracy, who are being oppressed by some evil strongman. And if you just maybe have a critical perspective on Venezuela, then you think of the opposition just in terms of this clown, Juan Guaido, who rides around in the back of a motorcycle trying to start a coup. But the reality is right now the opposition is moving away from Guaido. There is a center-left, sort of traditional middle-class opposition and center-right that is sick of U.S. sanctions because they're destroying everyone's lives. The U.S. is about to end the exception on importing diesel for Venezuela, which I think any American can understand. Without diesel, we don't have trucks to bring us food, and the supermarkets don't have anything in them. There's no fruit, there's no meat, there's no nothing. That's what they want to do to Venezuela is absolutely genocidal, and they're catering to that radical reactionary element in Florida primarily, and not to average Venezuelans. So what we're seeing right now is an attempt at a rapprochement in Venezuela where the non-radical wings of the opposition are actually getting activated and trying to reinvigorate the democratic process so they can have a country again. And that is being, I could say, underreported by the U.S. It might actually be completely unreported. I would recommend sources like Venezuela Analysis, a website that actually does honest coverage of Venezuelan politics from a left perspective to better understand where the opposition, the whole spectrum of opposition is. And if I can just respond to your comment, which I thought was really on point, Jamal, every 4 years they tell us this is the most important election of our lifetimes. And everybody's freaking out right now on Twitter and saying, oh, I'm so anxious. What's going to happen? As if, the whole world's going to come falling down if Donald Trump wins. It's typically people supporting Biden who are saying that. The 2004 election for me was far more important than this election. That was the election in which Americans decided if they supported the Iraq War and the entire massive post 9/11 security state that George Bush had brought into being. And George W. Bush has committed far more crimes than Donald Trump has, contrary to Noam Chomsky saying that Trump is worse than Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. And so it's this hysteria that reflects a historical amnesia and a lack of context about how Trump came to be. It was because of Bush's reelection that these massive security state, the NSA surveillance, the Patriot Act, the AUMF, emergency law was consolidated, and it's still with us today, and we're still in Afghanistan. I don't think we're making those same kind of decisions in this election. This is an election more about what kind of culture will be and how America sees itself and wants to present itself to the world as it enters a stage of imperial decline.
Yeah, I'm with you there, Max. I don't agree that 4 years of a Trump presidency is equal to actual literal genocide. And, last thing I actually want to say for all of my fellow Floridians that are upset that things seem to be trending towards Trump, well, what did you think was going to happen, y'all? It's Florida. But with that, we're going to move to another quick break here on Radio Sputnik's live coverage of election 2020. We'll be right back. So please stay with us.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
You're listening to special coverage on Radio Sputnik.
Oh, yes, we have returned Radio Sputnik Election Night 2020. I am Sean Blackman, hosted by Any Means Necessary here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. with my co-host, the Jackie Luqman, and still being joined by Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan of Fault Lines, also here on Radio Sputnik. And we, we are now happy to be joined by Tim Canova, a law professor and future candidate for Congress in Florida. Tim, thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Nice to be with you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Tim, I can't even really call it, but I'm glad that we're talking with you today, Tim, because, one thing that has been, I think, a serious, almost a defining characteristic in a way of the election season here in the United States, certainly since people have started going to the polls. And, that's this issue of, voter suppression and all the different tactics that's not just being used to suppress voters, but sort of the actual, processes by which I think a lot of these votes are being taken in and counted and all these sorts of things. And I feel like there have been several tactics and strategies that have been deployed, I think, from different elements to that end. And I was hoping you could sort of expound upon that for us here on election night.
Sure. Well, we've seen, going back to 2016 in particular, or of course it goes back even further, but speaking from 2016, we saw an awful lot of voter suppression done electronically. Perhaps most famously was what happened in New York City with the Board of Elections purging about 200,000 voters from their registration rolls and doing it electronically, and what seemed to be in a very targeted way to disenfranchise Sanders voters in the primary. And there was actually a Justice Department consent decree in which the Board of Elections admitted to its failures, admitted to its law-breaking, promised never to do it again. Another way of disenfranchising voters is to simply rig the actual electronic vote count, which we also saw lots of evidence of happening in both 2016 and 2018. What's frustrating is it doesn't really get investigated by any law enforcement. Instead, it's election integrity activists and specialists, experts who crunch the numbers. And for instance, in my own races against Wasserman Schultz, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the experts found the final numbers mathematically implausible in 2016 and mathematically impossible in 2018. So these are very covert, opaque ways to disenfranchise voters.
Yeah, Tim, I can't help but think about the unofficial ways that the Trump administration in particular is using kind of on the sly. It's like they're saying the quiet part out loud and not actually issuing orders for people to disrupt people going to the polls, but throwing out the dog whistles. And that's what people are doing. And I'm wondering, what your take is on this phenomenon of the Trump caravans, the Trump trains, blocking highways and keeping people from going to polls, some of them getting even police escorts. Have you seen a lot of that in Florida? Are you getting reports of people having problems with people being intimidated at the polls? And since I'm not seeing a whole lot of pushback from local authorities, not like I expected any, to protect people at the polls. They seem to be very lackadaisical in confronting these people and, pushing them off and making them go home. Do you see any effort to deal with these issues in the future? Because I don't know. I'm cynical. I think I'm just so cynical at this point that I believe everything bad that's happening is just going to keep happening. I think this is going to continue to be a trend. What's your thinking on this phenomenon?
I haven't seen or read a single news report of anyone being prevented or blocked or intimidated from going to a voting station, a voting precinct to vote in Florida. Not one. I have certainly seen a lot of evidence of the Trump caravans on the roads, but I must say they have looked incredibly peaceful in Florida. I haven't seen any violence really in any way, whether it's Trump activists directing violence at Biden activists or vice versa. I must say that the caravans look more like, free speech, people getting out there and, publicly expressing their support and doing it in a nonviolent way. I just don't see any suppression in that kind of a physical way going on at all this year. And I've been paying attention to the news and just don't see it happening at all.
So I want to give an update real quick. The Biden campaign, they were talking about Florida. Biden, let's see, the Biden campaign offers this update on Florida. We said Florida was going to be close, and it is. We also said we didn't have to win it, and that remains true. We're encouraged by by some of the gains, especially in the suburbs, that could have national ramifications. Now, I want to move to Wisconsin for a moment also, and this is Kara Cordy. I followed her during the Sanders. She was on point for Sanders coverage. She makes the point, she says Biden leads with young people in Wisconsin by 33. Clinton carried this group in 2016 by 3 points. Young Wisconsin voters are likely more to say that they want the POTUS to be Biden as opposed to Trump. Let me see the men. Biden making gains, trailing the president of the United States by 3 points. A group Donald Trump won by more than 14 in 2016. So it seems that, there are certain trends, at the very least in Wisconsin, that are trending towards Joe Biden.
Yes, that is all true. And I think we see that in Florida for sure. We also do see a lower turnout from what I'm hearing among younger voters in Florida, at least. And the president getting a somewhat higher percentage of Hispanics, not just Cuban Americans, but certainly doing very well among Cuban Americans, and even a higher percentage among African Americans. It might be a historic high for a Republican in many decades in that regard. Of course, he started at a very low level with African Americans, but particularly with African American men, he seems to be showing some kind of a surge. Whether that's enough to overcome some of the other trends you're talking about, which also seem real, I don't know. It's too early, I think, to tell.
Yeah, just tagging on to that last point, Tim. No, thanks, Sean. Just tagging on to that last point, Tim. We were just talking about this with Max Blumenthal. Actually, Cuban neighborhoods specifically, this is from the New York Times, their little election needle thingy. Cuban neighborhoods have swung dramatically towards Trump. It's a 14-point difference from 55% Democratic support back in 2016 to 59% Republican support in the precincts that that have been completely returned at this point. Wow, got Max's take in the last segment. I'm curious to hear yours, Tim. Why do you think that specific shift has happened in the south of Florida with Cuban neighborhoods?
I do think there's a perception in Cuban neighborhoods that Joe Biden is too close to those who are very left in the Democratic Party. Of course, Cuban Americans, especially older generation Cuban Americans, have the memory of communist oppression. Younger Cubans less so, but I do think the president painting this as a contest between socialism and capitalism has probably resonated to some degree in that community.
Yeah, and I have a similar question, actually, Tim, in terms of, if you have any insight into why you think maybe youth turnout wasn't that high in the state of Florida, and also what may be behind this seeming surge of support for Trump from black men that you mentioned a moment ago.
My feeling is perhaps the hidden story to some degree is the divide between a shutdown and opening up the economy. And the economic shutdowns that have occurred in Florida and in other states, and I do think it's been less severe in Florida than some other states, but I think the hardship has fallen more harshly on younger voters and on minority communities. And their patience for shutdowns is probably lower than for some higher income groups, including older voters and whiter voters. And I think in the last presidential debate, there was a bit of a contrast where Trump was talking about opening this economy up. And of course, that's going to open him up to some criticism by those who are continually talking about the COVID problems. And Biden painted a much darker picture about we're going to have to shut down and a dark winter ahead and all of that. That could be part of the explanation why Trump is doing, or I should say why younger voters are coming out with a lower participation, and why African Americans might be, at least to some degree, shifting a little bit towards the president. I don't want to overstate it.
Yeah.
Of course, Biden is still going to win a big majority of the African American community, but going from single digits to maybe 15% or more, it would be a rather significant jump for the president among African Americans.
Yeah, and I think that is part of the overall GOP strategy. Not that, I feel like, Trump was making a big deal about getting, into double-digit support among African Americans. I don't think he believed that would translate to a win for him, but it does expand the GOP base, I think, because even the GOP party bosses know that their own party is not expanding, and they've got to get new people in that party in some way. And unfortunately, I feel like all of the hype about the lowest unemployment numbers among African Americans ever in history was, for me, it was just like, the lie that Trump kept telling that may have, right along with what you just said, Tim, opening up the country in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic when the government is not doing anything to support people, citizens, workers through this crisis, might have factored into some of those people's decisions to view Trump opening up the economy favorably and support him, where maybe they wouldn't have had all of these factors not converge together. But I'm wondering what you think about this way that Trump played the historical unemployment numbers against this need to open up the economy that some people felt like needed to be done.
It's a good point. In 2012, when the Republicans lost to President Obama in Obama's reelection, the Republicans had a postmortem. They called it the autopsy. And the one big suggestion that came through that autopsy, or the one imperative, was to expand their base, was to try to start attracting minority voters, Hispanic and African Americans. And it does seem a little ironic that that's kind of what Donald Trump seems to be doing today. Whether it's enough to carry him to victory, I'm not. No one's ready to say that at this point. But he does seem to be doing considerably better than Republicans have done in the past with those groups. I do think, as a matter of just empirical fact, the African American unemployment rate had fallen to perhaps a historic low before the pandemic. Of course, it's not there now, but none of the unemployment figures are there now. I was skeptical of the unemployment rate, the official rates, both under Obama and under Donald Trump, because so many people who are discouraged workers leave the workforce. It was particularly pronounced from 2008, the collapse, all the way through 2016. and labor participation had been rising. So I do think Trump was looking, he was in a stronger position before the pandemic. The pandemic has probably hurt him more than helped him overall. And I understand the Democratic argument that he didn't do enough to help working folks. That goes into I think the disputes between the Pelosi House and the White House on how much aid to give. But whether it's free market principles or real conviction, I'm not surprised that the administration's view was let's open this economy up as quickly as possible. Certainly the fatality rate from COVID has been dropping even as cases are spiking. And it is also true that the U.S. unemployment rate is significantly better than what we're finding in Europe, which has really embraced the shutdowns a lot more than we have here. My own feeling is no matter who wins this race, I am hoping that there is an opening up of the economy and a smarter way of dealing with the COVID pandemic than we've seen.
But Tim, come on. There have been 200,000, over 200,000 people dead from COVID. Our cases in the United States hit in 14 days, nearly, if I'm not mistaken, in 14 days we've hit 1 million cases, meaning the jump, the acceleration that we've been getting. And from the standpoint of Europe, Europe is not even close to us. There are more people in the European Union than there are in the United States, and yet it's not even close in regards to the number of dead that they have in the United States in comparison. Yes, I agree. We should have had a smarter way of doing this. But the idea that opening the economy up is the answer, I would make the argument that opening the economy up is the reason why these numbers are this high now, and that the reason why this stuff is out of control in the first place. I don't understand how, because right now.
I'd love to answer. I'd love to respond.
Go for it. I'm sorry.
One of my frustrations is that there's not enough real discussion and scrutiny of the numbers as there should be. We accept government numbers, whether it's the unemployment rate, as if they're gospel. We accept the COVID rates as if they're gospel. I have in front of me the CDC's own reports. I'm holding it in my hand right now. And there's lots of reasons to think that a large percentage, over 90% of those killed by the COVID, or I should say killed with COVID, had serious comorbidities and other causes of death. And there needs to be this discussion, but it's been taboo. It's been suppressed. It's been literally suppressed on social media. And I find that problematic from a First Amendment perspective.
I'd like to weigh in on this a little bit about the comorbidities. I feel like this is a real simple thing. I have a comorbidity. I have hypertension. My husband has diabetes. If we contract COVID-19, we end up in the hospital on ventilators and we die, would we have died had we not contracted COVID-19? So the issue of the comorbidities, I feel like is not it's not the issue here, because people die from what it is that sent them to the hospital and put them in intensive care. And in the case of 200 some people, that has been COVID-19. But as far as opening up the economy is concerned, here is the situation, I think, in this country. This government has not provided the basic materials that citizens have needed to protect themselves against a viral pandemic. This government, in wanting to open up businesses, but not wanting not wanting citizens to be safe, and claiming that they're opening up businesses for the good of the citizenry, I think is the basis of the problem. We live in a capitalist society that prioritizes profit over people, so that people are cheering opening up businesses instead of questioning why hasn't the government provided for the material needs of the people in the midst of this global pandemic.
About a minute left.
So just real quick election updates. Representative Ilhan Omar, Democrat, won re-election in Minnesota's 5th congressional district. John Hickenlooper, Democrat, wins the U.S. Senate seat in Colorado.
Absolutely. And I believe that's going to do it for the hour here on this election night 2020 live coverage of Radio Sputnik. We want to thank Tim Canova and Max Blumenthal so much for joining us. We'll be right back with more coverage, so please stay with us.